In 2008, they discovered a site in Turkey called Gobekli Tepe. Now, they had discovered it in the 1960s, but they made the wrong assumption that basically it was a graveyard for a Christian church or something along those lines. Now, when they started to excavate the site, they realized that they discovered a series of large stone sculptures arranged in a circle, very much like Stonehenge in Europe, that dated from around 10,000 BCE. Located near this circle of stones was also a city that had sprung up around the stones, basically, probably because it was a religious center. The interesting thing about this discovery is that it predates the 8,000 year mark that most historians agree is the beginnings of when farming and agriculture started to develop. So to have an entire city of around 4,000 to 6,000 people spring up around a religious center in 10,000 BCE without a consistent agricultural culture surrounding it means something about why we have evolved the way we have and how we've developed. Originally, there was this idea that there was a so-called Neolithic revolution around 8,000 BCE in which we discovered farming and then we settled down. So to have people settle down in a large city means that there's something wrong with our theory about why we became sedentary. Now, what most historians believe now is that it probably has something to do with how our brains evolved, and it has to do with neuropsychology or neuroscience. The suggestion that we got together in groups of communities in order to secure resources because that's how we evolved, and that farming is a result of us figuring stuff out in a sort of group thinking situation, and that's why we have formed large social networks. The things about the development of this city also let us know how important religion and also even art was to culture even before we were able to basically stockpile grains that we had grown ourselves. Now, something to keep in mind is that the people at Gobekli Tepe and other Neolithic people before the creation of agriculture or farming, they did have storehouses and warehouses probably where they kept wild grain that they had harvested over time, and also that they had probably figured out how to preserve meat by smoking it or something like that, or drying it out. So we know that they probably were smart enough to develop or to create large caches of food and resources to be able to sustain a large community. So this also means that we don't necessarily need agriculture at that point in time to live in a community of this size. Now, the other thing it also indicates is that art is really important to this civilization or to early civilizations. We know that in the Paleolithic era, there were tons of cave paintings and other artifacts, and who knows what was made out of materials that have decayed or disappeared since then. At Gobekli Tepe, they found not only this sort of big stone temple, they also found these poles with anamorphic, animal-shaped carvings on them, one or two of them giving birth to some sort of child or creature and surrounded by snakes. They also found some sculptures of men with erections, and they also found some sculptures of human beings, particularly of men. So what I'd like to focus on here is the life-size portrait or statue of a male figure. If you look at the sculpture, I think one of the first things that you'll kind of get is that it's a relief sculpture carved probably from a single block of stone. It's shaped more or less like a human male, and we think this because it's lacking breasts. The arms of the sculpture are at its sides, and it also has hands that are clasped across its middle and probably holding some sort of animal. There are 5 fingers. The torso itself has either a necklace or some sort of garment draped around its shoulders that hangs down in sort of like a roughly V shape. And the head itself, well, not exactly realistic, is very human formed. It's got 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, and the proportions are roughly correct, although the head itself is very large and the proportions don't accurately match a human being. It seems like we're missing anything below the knees on this. We also don't know if this sculpture or anything else at this site was painted. We do have traces of pigment on some other things in some other sites, but as far as I can tell, I don't think that they found any traces of any kind of paint left on this sculpture. Now, another little blip that you should be aware of is that the provenance of this sculpture is not clear. It's generally accepted that it was found at this site in a place called Urfa, but I haven't been able to find out too much more beyond that. Now, the reason why I want to show you this sculpture is I want to compare it to this Stonehenge-like arrangement of the megaliths that we were talking about earlier. And there are some formal or physical similarities to these two kinds of sculptures. For instance, on some of these T-shaped stone columns or sculptures, they have the hands that are wrapped around the front. Clearly, they're wearing a loincloth and something is hanging down. So the arrangement of the hands is very similar to the hands in the sculpture that we were looking at. However, the two T-shaped sculptures don't have heads on them the way this sculpture has a head on it. So that's kind of an important thing. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is we don't necessarily know what this sculpture means, and we don't necessarily know what the carvings and the ornamentation of the columns or megaliths mean. But we do know from later civilizations that usually when you make a sculpture of a person, it's either to honor that human being, or it's a god, or it's something else that represents something that's very important to the people who sculpted it. The reason why we believe it's important to the people who sculpted it is because it takes considerable time and resources to make a sculpture, especially of this size. And we also know that it takes several generations to train people to be able to do stone carving like this. And remember that this is before they had metal tools in which to do it. So they're doing these sculptures with stone against stone. Now, both of the sculptures are in what we think of as a religious center, and there is some indication that in other cultures, sculptures like this were either figures that represented worshipers or of gods. So those are two possible explanations, that the sculpture of the Urfa man is a sculpture of a worshiper. Maybe the columns are sculptures of worshipers, and they might have even had heads, although when you look at the excavations, it doesn't look like there's a place where a head had been attached. And the reason why I bring this up is oftentimes we do a lot of overinterpretation, but we don't really know what these people were thinking. Now, another interesting thing about these sculptures is that they are carved with relief carvings of animals, often vultures and some sort of birds actually juggling some kind of balls. We see scorpions. We also see some sort of wild animals that could be wild pigs and wild cattle. Those are all similar things that are found at later sites as well. Now, the other thing about these sculptures, which is significant, and I don't want to focus too much on it, but basically all of the animals, or most of the animals, are aggressive wild animals that can hurt you, and they all sport erections. So it seems like there is images of childbirth, images of men with erections, and wild animals as well on this site, carved on these columns and pillars. Now, if these columns and pillars represent human beings, which I think it's reasonable to think that they might, then what do these carvings represent on them? First of all, do they represent textiles or clothing with some sort of prints or some sort of paintings on them? Or do they represent body tattoos or some sort of scarification? We don't know. They also, keep in mind, these could just be columns or just big religious megaliths that are carved with some kinds of stories. And when we studied the earlier periods in the Paleolithic period, a lot of the kinds of things painted on the walls, such as wild animals and animal hunts and bison and wild cattle and animals that they were hunting, is consistent with this. And we think that the possibility of in the Paleolithic painting, that the reason why people painted these things was to have some sort of control over the natural world through some sort of supernatural way. Or another reason might be that these paintings represent historical events. So we're not really sure what or how these images were used. We know that the symbols and the things painted on them are fairly consistent what we see from the Paleolithic region or Paleolithic era. And one of the other things that I think is notable is that most of the animals are carved in a way that you can see them the best. They're in profile points of view, and often we get to see what the animal looks like. So these are trained artists who have had several generations of learning how to stone carve and also traditions of making art. And the same thing is kind of true in the Paleolithic era. Now, one of the other things that sort of supports some of these ideas is that when you look at other cultures that have similar technologies, for instance, culture from the Tlingit people in the 19th century, they had similar kinds of images having to do with birth, also having to do with some sort of ornamentation of a full figure. For instance, there's a grizzly bear house divider. It was actually a partition that you crawl through. And on the screen, you can see that there are other images that are embedded that are of animals and faces. And this is kind of similar to some of the columns that we see at Gobekli Tepe. One of the other things that they discovered when they were excavating Gobekli Tepe is that they discovered some skulls that had been preserved after death. And they found that some of the skulls even had been painted with red ochre. So the skulls had some sort of post-mortem etchings or carvings done into the skull itself. And we are sort of going out on a limb, but it's based on another site from a couple of sites later. Jericho and Çatalhöyük all have instances where people would preserve the skulls and bodies literally in their homes of their ancestors as a way to honor them and possibly for religious reasons. And so it's possible that this tradition started at Gobekli Tepe, where they started excavating skulls. And this is a good jumping off point for looking at later civilizations that happen and begin around 8000 BCE when they actually do have agriculture.